The Woman in Black, Part 2. Mr. Bentley to stop, and almost before he had time to do so, climbed out of the pony and trap into the lane, and stood on a grassy knoll, gazing first up at the house, so handsome, so utterly right for its position it occupied, a modest house, and yet sure of itself, and then looking across the country beyond. I had no sense of having been here before, but an absolute conviction that I would come here again, that the house was already mine, bound to me invisibly. To one side of it a stream ran between the banks towards the meadow beyond, whence it made its meandering way down to the river. Mr. Bentley was now looking at me curiously from the trap. "A fine place," he called. I nodded, but quite unable to impart to him any of my extreme emotions, turned my back upon him and walked a few yards up the slope from where I could see the entrance to the old, overgrown orchard that lay behind the house and petered out in a long grass and tangled thicket at the far end. Beyond that, I glimpsed the perimeter of some rough-looking open land. The feeling of conviction I have described was still upon me, and I remember that I was alarmed for it. For I had never been in an imaginative or fanciful man, and certainly not one given to visions of the future. Indeed, since those earlier experiences I had deliberately avoided all contemplation of any remotely non-material matters, and clung to the prosaic, the visible, and the tangible. Nevertheless, I was quite unable to escape the belief, nay, I must call it more the certain knowledge, that this house was one day to be my home, that sooner or later, though I had no idea when, I would become the owner of it. When I finally accepted and admitted this to myself, I felt on that instant a profound sense of peace and contentment settle upon me, such as I had not known for many years, and it was the light heart that I returned to the pony and trap where Mr. Bentley was awaiting me, more than a little curiously. The overwhelming feeling I had experienced at Monk's Peace remained with me, albeit not in the forefront of my mind, when I left the country that afternoon to return to London. I had told Mr. Bentley that if he were ever to hear the house was for sale, I should be eager to know of it. Some years later, he did so. I contacted the agents that same day, and hours later, without so much as returning to see it again. I had offered for it, and my offer was accepted. A few months prior to this, I had met Esme Ainley. Our affection for one another had been increasingly steadily, but cursed as I was by my indecisive nature in all personal and emotional matters, I had remained silent as my intentions for the future. I had enough sense to take the news about Monk's Peace as a good omen, however, and a week after I had formally become the owner of the house, travelled into the country with Esme and proposed marriage to her among the trees of the old orchard. This offer, too, was accepted, and very shortly afterwards we were married and moved at once to Monk's Peace. On that day, I truly believed that I had last come out from under the long shadow cast by the events of my past, and saw from the face and felt from the warmth of his hand clasp that Mr. Bentley believed it too, and that a burden had been lifted from his own shoulders. He had always blamed himself, at least in part, for what happened to me. It had, after all, been he who had sent me on my first journey up to Crichton Gifford and Eelmarsh House, and to the funeral of Mrs. Drablow. But all of that could not have been further from my conscious thought, at least, as I stood taking in the night air at the door in my house, on that Christmas Eve. For some 14 years now, Monk's Peace had been the happiest of homes, Esme's and mine, and that of her 4 children by her first marriage to Captain Ainley. In the early days I had come here only at weekends and holidays, but London life and business began to irk me from the day that I bought the place, and I was glad indeed to retire permanently into the country at the earliest opportunity.